Welcome back to my channel, and today we talk about the art of podcast interviewing. I have a podcast agency myself, and I help many company founders and content creators to launch their own podcasts. And one common fear is hosting a podcast. Me think, what do successful podcast hosts have in common? And I made a small mini series to break this down. And in the first episode, I want to talk about the art of mastering podcast interviews by Joe Rogan. I think I don't have to introduce Joe Rogan anymore. Joe Rogan is a really experienced podcaster and podcast host with I think over 1,000 or 2,000 episodes in his Joe Rogan Experience, talking to scientists, talking to conspiracy theorists, talking to celebrities, to fighters, and much more. And I think it doesn't matter who sits on his table, he always manages to have a conversation with them over hours. And there must be some secret sauce behind this, and we dive into it today. What makes Joe Rogan's interview style so special? First up, and one of the most important points that I always tell my clients, but also that you can see in Joe Rogan's interview style, is his art of preparation. He is frenetically prepared for every single guest. He knows facts from years in the past. He knows about tweets, he knows about Facebook posts, he knows about controversies, he knows about everything. And I understand that, for example, on a small scale level, it's more difficult if it's not a celebrity, if it's not a scientist. How do you find information from a podcast guest? What I always like to do is to type their name into Google and search for pictures, because a lot of times pictures are indexed from old Facebook posts, from Medium pages, from old blogs that people don't even know that they still exist. But you can really find a lot of surprising things of podcast guests in Google search. And a lot of times when I do this and they ask me like, how did you find this information? It's most of the time from a Google image search. So be prepared. If you prepare yourself for a podcast, prepare yourself really deeply. Maybe have a chat with the podcast guest beforehand. Always try to dive as deep as possible into the guest and try to make it as interesting as possible, of course, for the listener. And this is also something that you can see, and it doesn't matter with whom Joe Rogan talks, he shows this impressively in a lot of occasions, that he knows facts about people, but not only that, that he also is very informed about specific topics. And what he likes to do is he prepares himself with videos, or he prepares himself with documentaries, or he's gonna read a book about it. He never comes to the podcast and improvises. He always knows what he's talking about for the most part, and this makes him a very good podcast host. The second thing that makes Joe Rogan a really good podcast host is his unlimited amount of curiosity. He's genuinely curious about every single podcast guest, and you can see this by always asking follow-up questions. So this is something that you also can take with you. Don't just ask a question, say and move on. Try to take this question and try to go deeper. The power of podcasting is, of course, that you can cut out as much as you want, but you cannot cut anything in afterwards. So ask away, ask deeper questions. Try to go really into depth of a certain topic, because only after asking 2, 3, 4 times, the person really starts to also explain their whys, their hows, their struggles. If you stay on the surface, you get a really boring interview question. And I think the only reason why the episodes of Joe Rogan are more than 3 hours is because he asks really in-depth questions and really tries to go to the core of what does the person really want to say. And this is something you can take into your own podcast. Ask follow-up question, ask deep question, and prepare yourself for those deep questions. The next thing sounds very obvious, but is the art of listening. A lot of podcast hosts I see are not listening actively what the guest is saying. They have the interview script and they try to follow this interview script as much as possible, while a good podcast host like Joe Rogan lets the conversation happen. If someone wants to go down a rabbit hole, he's always following the guest down the rabbit hole into the craziest details, and this makes a really good podcast host, that you can decide between how much rabbit hole do I allow a person to go into, and when go out of the rabbit hole and move on maybe with my script and move on maybe with my story. A lot of times what I see is that podcast hosts try to retract people if they go off track, because of course you want to keep your preparation, you want to keep your storyline alive. And what you can see a lot of times is that it's not so much about the interview of the person, but it's more the interview of the host. So next time when you see someone going into a rabbit hole, try to follow him. And if you see that this goes nowhere, or this topic goes too far, or it's not something that you feel comfortable talking about, try to get back on track and try to get the person out with another question, maybe for a different topic, or you can use transitional questions to shift gears, to switch topics. All those kind of tools are very important for a podcast host to narrate the story, but also listen. And I see that a lot of people don't really want to listen. They really want to push on their own podcast script, their own podcast story, and this never leads to a good conversation. I think what Joe Rogan does really well, he's not only asking questions, but he really creates a conversation in a podcast. And not a lot of people can do this. I think there's a big difference between being an interviewer or being a podcast host. The interviewer tries to get, for example, a certain amount of information for a story, or for example, for a certain angle angle of an article or of a movie, but a podcast host can also allow conversations. I think this is really powerful in a podcast, that you have the chance to really sit down with someone and talk with this person over 1 hour, over 2 hours, over 3 hours. No matter how long it takes, you can cut out things, you can let it make sense in post-production. But for allowing a conversation to happen, there you have to be really open to, and this is something that you have to decide before the podcast starts and not when you hit record. The fourth thing that I found out watching endless podcast interviews by Joe Rogan is that he's very authentic. He really tries to be himself. He's not a different person. He's not trying to be someone else. He's really himself. This is also something that he learned, by the way, because if you go all the way back to one of the first episodes, you can see he was still a little bit trying to keep up a certain persona that he wanted to be, but now he manages to adapt to every single guest while still standing strong also on his opinion. And I think this is something that is very important, to be authentic and to let the authenticity also come into the interview. Don't be too strict to yourself. Try to be very honest, try to be vulnerable, try to be transparent, because those are the basic ingredients to make your guest also a little bit more comfortable with the situation, a little bit more comfortable being in a podcast and also sharing more with you. And if podcast guests share more with you, that only resonates into better stories, and better stories always resonate into more people listening and into more people viewing your podcast. Another technique that Joe Rogan is using is playing around with being very philosophical and being very factual. And I think this is something that in a lot of podcasts is missing, that questions go normally in one direction. That can be, for example, going only into a factual, like what did you do there? How was your vita? Can we talk about this moment in your life, this moment in your life? Another technique that Joe Rogan is using, and this is one of my favorite techniques, is to ask philosophical questions when the conversation gets too serious. I've witnessed this a couple of times in his conversations, because I think that a lot of people know exactly what to answer because they've rehearsed it so many times. Everyone knows where they went to school, how they changed jobs, and they made sense of their childhood and how they grew up. And when he feels that people get too much into this autopilot answering mode, he asks philosophical questions. Do you believe in life after death? Do you think the US went to the moon? Do you think there is life on Mars? And then what happens then is a lot of times you get your person out of autopilot mode and people start to actually think, because maybe they have never thought about these questions. And once you make your guests think, you really realize that the answers after that will be much more honest, will be much more transparent, and the conversation will get a lot more fun. So next time when you interview someone, have a couple of prepared philosophical interview questions ready, because even if you don't use the material afterwards, you get your person out of the autopilot mode and you talk about interesting topics, and who knows, maybe it's a big hit that you can use for a podcast and it makes your story and it makes people listen. All those techniques that I mentioned before are really helpful tools to make you a better podcast host. Whether you're a starting podcast host or already experienced, I think a couple of tips you can use for your own podcast to make it a little bit more alive, to make it a little bit more exciting, and to make it also a little bit more adventurous. Joe Rogan had a lot of success with his podcast, but of course we also have to consider that he did over 1,000 episodes where he could really learn his craft, learn his skills. But I think there are a couple of nice things that you can use and to throw in and to test with several guests into your next podcast episodes. Thank you so much for watching my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe the video, and I have a lot of other videos coming up. In the next videos I'm going to talk about how Ali Abdaal or Lex Fridman, also very successful podcast hosts, ask their question and what interview techniques they use to make their podcast successful. Until then, you can watch my weekly vlogs to be updated about everything that I do building a podcast agency, and I would really appreciate if you like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next video.